Just a moment. Okay. It's okay, Philippe. I think we can start.
Thank you so much. Let's be patient. We will begin very few seconds. Okay, I think we can know someone is talking or listening to radio or a video. Please, can you put your be put on mute? Okay. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Christophe Caldwell for a webinar on the theme of the United States, the risk ahead. Given the current political tensions, the timing of this topic could be more than opportune. You may notice it, as Americans and Europeans are about to clash violently in Davos for the first time in 85 years, not over matters of principle, but over shared borders. Of course, we all on both sides of the Atlantic are looking at the force inside the country, the force inside the United States, which are pushing in which direction, and the forces inside Europe, which are pushing in different direction, maybe. We don't know exactly what will be the future. But no one is better suited to address this subject than Christophe Caldwell, both as a recognized American expert on international affairs and US affairs, and also as a connoisseur of European and transatlantic issues, and for very long years. Christophe is a contributing editor at the Claremont Review of Books and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He is a Harvard graduate who has spent his career as an author and journalist. Previously a senior editor at the Weekly Standard and a columnist for the Financial Times, he is the author of Reflection on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam, and the West, and for the New York Times bestseller, The Age of Entitlements, America since the 60s. He publishes in the best national and international think tank journals. The webinar will explore new sources of instability that have arisen from institutional changes since the start of the Trump administration. It will focus on the strengthening position of the Democrats vis-à-vis Trump and the strengthening position of the left within the Democratic Party, both of which increase the risk of constitutional confrontation with, of course, many consequences not only for the US, but also for the rest of the world and especially for Europe. Christophe Caldwell will take a calm, objective and balanced look at all these questions which have unleashed passions since the start of Donald Trump's second term, and especially in recent days, nationally and internationally. I would like to ask all listeners not only to reserve their substantive questions for the end of Christopher's presentation, but also please to avoid any emotional questions, as the newspaper already bombards us with enough of that kind, and to focus on the risks and scenarios that Christopher's original analysis suggests. Allow me to thank Christopher for agreeing to give this presentation, especially given the current situation and tensions on both sides of the Atlantic. We have much to learn from these analyses. Christopher, the floor is yours for as long as you need, after which we will move on to the Q&A session. And in any case, we will close the session at 4 p.m. so as not to take up too much of everyone's time. Thank you so much, Christopher. It is now up to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Philippe. And Thank you for the invitation. Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'm honored to be here, and we'll talk about we'll talk about the subject that this presentation was announced as addressing, which is migrants, tariffs, and alliances. But it has a slightly different flavor, I think, than when we envisioned it a few weeks or months ago. I think that under the present circumstances, what I'm going to say will probably be a little bit more about Donald Trump than it would have been had I delivered the talk a couple of months ago. And I'll have to speak about some recent and kind of newsy events, even, at the risk of reacting to things that have not fully developed factually. I want to say I will try to stay away from macroeconomics and finance and business and your bread and butter, although it'll be necessary to address economics and economic policy a little bit to sort of situate ourselves. So, but I'd like to talk a little bit about economics now, and I think that will help us when we move on to questions of international relations. Donald Trump right now is sort of dominating the international discussions. He seems to be operating from, in certain ways, he is still operating from a position of strength within the United States. So I'd like to talk a bit about his strengths, then a bit about his weaknesses. One of the great pluses for Trump is the economic record of his first administration. And this has been a sort of a mystery to a lot of analysts, because it doesn't look like the Trump economy in his first administration was particularly successful. You had lower per capita GDP growth than you did under Barack Obama, and now I'm talking about the first 3 years of the Trump administration before COVID broke out. You had lower per capita GDP growth, but you did have a rise in the median income, and the gains of that period were better spread than they have been in other administrations. So that doesn't look very impressive in the statistics, but working people experienced the first Trump administration as a pleasant time economically, and have tended to think of Trumpian populism as something that works. I think we could debate why. That would take a long time, and this is not the place for it. But it probably has something to do with his talking down of immigration, the tightening of the labor market, and the increase of wages among the lowest quartile, the bottom 2 quartiles of workers. 2020, there was a different economy, but we'll discuss that a little later on. The long and short, though, is that there's a Trump model of the economy, and to a degree that is hard to appreciate outside of the United States, voters have tended to like it. A key to this economy, as I say, is immigration. Immigration in every country in the West is, in one way or another, driving politics. In this second term, Trump has been able to move against immigration even more effectively. There have been days since he was president when daily immigration to the United States has been a couple hundred a day, as opposed to days in the Biden administration when there were thousands or tens of thousands a day. These are the lowest immigration numbers since the 1970s. The population of foreign-born Americans has fallen for the first time since the 1920s. And when you look at an incident, when you look at an operation like an immigration operation like the one that's going on in Minnesota now, I think Americans are united in finding the killing of a woman during a protest, a lamentable, tragic, and totally regrettable thing. But the issue itself and the idea of trying to move against illegal immigration in Minnesota is still quite popular, particularly in the wake of lots of stories about immigrant welfare fraud in Minnesota. And if you go on social media, you find these reports about, fraud, rioting, all sorts of things in Minnesota. They get millions of views. So there are just a couple of the two things that I want to leave you with in terms of immigration is people tend to like the economic results, and it's still working for Trump. There's been a tremendous cultural change in the United States over the medium. I can discuss it over the medium term, but also over the short term. One way to look at it over the medium term, let's just say the social order that Trump came in to topple had become very unpopular. There was a very interesting analysis of the American social order and political order in the New Left Review in September, October by Dylan Riley and Robert Brenner, and I will quote a sentence or two about it. They noted that in the United States, 38% of Americans over 25 have bachelor's degrees. That's a very big change. And if you look at it in terms of the electorate, in the 2022 midterms, 56% of the people voting have college degrees. So there's a strong elite, very politically powerful culture in the United States, concentrated in, according to the authors, education, healthcare, nonprofits, and apparatuses of corporate compliance, to the point where the number of people working in these sectors now exceeds the number of people working in manufacturing. And again, to quote the authors, these bodies are dedicated to offering technocratic solutions to social problems, above all, racial discrimination. I think that the anti-woke part of the Trump agenda has that too remains extremely popular because it's seen as striking a blow against the ideological arm of a kind of, let's say, technocratic elite. So there's a lot of ambient populism still in the United States, and I'll leave you just with one example, which I'm not really competent to talk about the merits of, but you can see it in the way Robert F. Kennedy, the son of the senator, is now in the Trump cabinet, and he has promoted theories of nutrition that during the campaign were much ridiculed and used against Trump. But you'll find that now these views of nutrition, which basically invert the old food pyramid that we used to have, so that people are now told not to eat their vegetables, but to eat fewer carrots and eat more eggs and steaks and that sort of thing. Americans are actually beginning to follow that and consider it sensible. I won't go into it any further, but it is an indication that there's something that's clicking in this revolution. Now, the problem for Trump is that the social and economic matters on which he had a measure of success are getting much more complicated, and you could see that certainly with so-called Liberation Day tariffs of last April, which worked out in a sort of catastrophic way, both for the Americans' savings accounts and for Trump politically. Right now, we're in a Supreme Court we're in the middle of a Supreme Court case about whether Trump has the authority to impose tariffs as an executive. It's not what the Constitution says, but there's legislation in the 1970s by Jimmy Carter that says that the president can do it in an economic emergency. These may well be the Trump's authority to levy tariffs that way may well be overturned. But probably there are other means for him to do this, and he will maintain a significant ability to affect world trade through tariffs for the in the near and middle term. But so that he doesn't have as much of a bureaucratic problem as people have said, but he does have a popularity problem. And so before we move on to, before we move on to other economic issues, and I'd like to talk about and on to foreign policy issues, I'd like to talk about where Trump now stands in the polls. The Wall Street Journal took a poll about a week ago. Perhaps you've seen it, but in case you haven't, I will just say that that people in Washington, D.C. have kind of been chewing it over for the past week. And the upshot of the poll is that the public is kind of unimpressed with Trump. His support has softened, but it's really not it's not too bad with if you compare it to Biden, Trump's first term, and even late Obama. His approval is in the 42% range, maybe a little higher. That is not sufficient to give him a lot of, let's just say, momentum, but it's probably sufficient to protect him from impeachment. How's that? 50% of the country say they think the economy is getting worse. Most people also say that Trump is using foreign policy to ignore growing domestic economic problems. But there's one number in this Wall Street Journal poll which I think is very important for Trump and explains a lot of the way the United States is developing now. And that is 65% of the public say his policies favor the rich. And that is a real change from how people perceived Trump in the first term and at the start of this term. It's not totally clear why that is. It may be due to certain policies involving AI, which is getting much less popular, particularly due to its environmental impact, both in terms of electricity and in terms of the ugliness of the data centers that it requires. But people are unhappy with it, and so one thing that you do see, I should add that this unhappiness is particularly strong among young people. And although young people are sort of radical, a good proportion of young people are radicalized in a kind of conservative way, this is not translated into Republican Party registration. So it leaves open the question of whether there is really any base at all for the part of the Trump era Republican Party that doesn't consist of Donald Trump himself. So to get back to this Trump favoring the rich allegation from his this sentiment from the Wall Street Journal poll, you notice Trump now moving to a more populist kind of managed economy, trying to regulate his way to a more progressive income distribution. It's not totally unlike the vision of Senator Elizabeth Warren about 10 or 15 years ago. A couple of weeks ago, he said he would like to cap credit card rates at a level of about a third of where they are now, which you probably followed that yourself. He's obviously said he's going to take a managerial or directorial role in the way Venezuela's seized oil reserves are dealt with. And just this morning, he announced, or did it last night, I suppose, an executive order limiting the acquisition of multiple residences for investment. This is not a tax on second homes or a wealth tax type of thing, but just like the idea of large financial institutions coming into a neighborhood and buying up a lot of housing stock and that kind of thing. You can see this kind of there's a lot of discussion of this at Davos there. I think in a way his economic model is Operation Warp Speed. The way he the program through which the United States developed its COVID vaccines, which is extremely generous to businesses in the way of sort of, providing them with resources if they enter into a relationship with the government, and it can be very effective, as it was during COVID, and it's not totally unlike the sort of the French, the method of the French plan during the so-called 30 glorious years after the war. But it's very, there are dangers to it too. And I think that this is what is leading a lot of Americans to think that Trump is favoring those with access over those who do not have it. This attempt to be populist may explain, I don't want to go too much into this, but we ought to address his pressure on Jerome Powell. I think that Trump really does want to bring down interest rates for homeowners, but he has really touched a third rail. And I think that if you look at how polls are reacting, if you look at how Republican politicians are reacting, particularly senators, not just Tom Tillis certainly, but who's retiring, but also Lisa Murkowski, but not just them, not just people who've been on the record as being anti-Trump. Trump is losing those people. He's lost Larry Kudlow, who has been a former New York banker, who's been a prominent television host, supporter of Trump's. And if he's lost those people, he's going to lose this. So there's not this the way things are aligned now. Trump does not look like he can win on Powell, so he will, I believe, retreat. But that's just the way it looks right now. Okay, so now we can move on to what they're discussing at Davos. First, I'd like to say, when we, which is to say, we'll discuss some foreign policy now. The two areas that looked like they would be really big when we first began talking about this, having this discussion, were Russia-related risk. That seems to me, strategically, for the United States, it seems to be quite limited. It's not quite so limited for Europe, but it is. But I think it is also. It's not very high for Europe. It's being raised, I think, right now by the American, or has been over the last few weeks, by Americans' willingness to pressure Russia over its shadow fleet and its shipping. I was very impressed by an analysis of the of Britain's declared intention to stop Russian tankers on the high seas. An analysis done by Anatole Lieven, which described this as a very dangerous development, and to the extent that Trump is countenancing it or offering any guarantees to Britain, it would probably be a misjudgment, and that does add risk. The second area that we would have talked about, maybe a little more, if not for the developments in Greenland, is Israel and the Middle East, and broadly speaking. Trump has said a lot of things about Israel, none of them really, certainly as long as we're focused on the sort of the building of the Gaza resort, these are things that really don't make enough sense to really even debate. But there is one thing that Trump did say in his national security strategy, released in November, which actually was an ideologically coherent document, is that with energy independence, the United States' incentives for remaining in the Middle East in a muscular way were kind of nearing their end. And it was curious, what you did not see in the national security strategy. You did not see a lot of talk about Israel, America's the only democracy in the Middle East and America's stalwart friend. So there is a sign that the United States is reducing its profile in the Middle East, and that is something that is going to have consequences as we move ahead from here. But none of them are really being seen quite yet. Now we can get to Greenland and the things that people are discussing at Davos this week. I think, first of all, if I could make a kind of a just a subjective interpretation of one episode in this, which is the European deployment of a multinational force to Greenland, however symbolic it was, strikes me as a great and classic kind of office miscalculation. I think that it seems to have been the hope of Europeans that they could send two messages at once, which is always hard to do. But I think the idea was to send the message to Trump that yes, we do take NATO defense of Greenland seriously, while sending the message to their voters that they were standing up to Trump. And Trump, unsurprisingly, only heard the latter message. I think, I think that most people have worked with people like Donald Trump. They seem focused on their own interests and their own way of doing things in a way that's kind of comic. They're self-interested and they're blind to everything. So it's very easy to think that the best way to deal with them is just say yes, and then if you go off and do something else, they won't notice. And it may be true that such people in any organization, they lack factual knowledge, or they may even lack curiosity, but they have a lot of curiosity about whether they're being obeyed or simply humored or whatever. And so they have an almost a psychic's sensitivity to their place in the pecking order. So while Trump was not, the spirit in which this exercise was carried out was not lost on Trump, and I think it's really exacerbated the problem greatly. All right, now let's talk about what the strategic rationale is in what Trump is doing. And there are strategic rationales. I think that if you let's look at Venezuela first, the action in Venezuela. the action in Venezuela, it seems to me, is much more about removing Latin America as a potential base for foreign actors, above all China. I don't think that Venezuela itself was a national security threat. The idea of Venezuela so close, the nearest of the continental Latin American countries to Miami, or of the major ones, that was unacceptable. So I think that most people can see the strategic case. The question is whether the strategic case was actually the strategic rationale. It was actually why it was carried out. The same is true in Greenland. One thing the administration is doing in Washington is they show you maps of Greenland that, and it's true, if you tip a globe so that the equator, say, runs between, Milwaukee and Moscow or something, you find, Greenland does sit right in the middle of the European and the American parts of the NATO alliance, kind of like the middle of a butterfly. But and it's true that, if there were ever a missile exchange between Russia and the United States, which seems like a kind of a Cold War thought, that a lot of it would pass over Greenland. That's not wrong, but I'm wondering if that is the actual cause of this dispute. One thing I would like to suggest, and here I'm going to be subjective again, is that the threat that Trump perceives in Greenland is NATO itself. And I don't think we've really discussed this enough. People look at Greenland and they say, well, look, acting this way, if you really do think Greenland is a strategic asset, is making the United States less safe. So why do it? Why not cooperate with our NATO allies and build whatever you need to build there? I think that Trump actually, what is going on now is that Trump has internalized the idea that NATO is a threat to the United States. And I do not mean in the sense that NATO would attack the United States or anything like that. I mean that he's internalized the critique from the 1990s that with the end of the Cold War, NATO is not a particularly fit for purpose alliance. Basically, the critique that George Kennan put forward after the Cold War, that it basically can only be used for, counterproductive adventures in empire building or democracy building and nation building, and of the sort that the George W. Bush administration did. And that at the same time, it sows resentment among nations that ought to be, if not our allies, then at least our partners, like Russia. But there's another thing I think that fits in with Trump's general modus operandi, which is that NATO seems, from the White House's perspective, like one of those venues where the tendencies in US politics that Trump is trying to get rid of are given reinforcement by Europe. And no one has really talked systematically about this aspect of the Trump worldview, but there is this idea of a global partisan conflict, which is, I think, at the heart of the speech that J.D. Vance gave in Munich last winter. So what I'm saying is, although Trump seemed to support NATO in June, when he declared himself pleased with their progress, in meeting their spending goals, it is not impossible that he just wants out. I'd like to raise another possibility. I don't know that it's a possibility, but it's a framework that I would suggest for thinking about these things. A lot of these moves seem to be in the direction of chaos. They seem to be a little bit chaotic. Why does the United States, why is the United States behaving this way? I think that a lot of people they're not angry, they're just sincerely mystified. And it may be that in a world order that is marked by great power competition and technological innovation, a technologically innovative great power could have an interest in chaos if it believes itself able to, say, master it better than other powers. What we're living out here, if I can now just address the constitutional aspect that we discussed at the start of our talk. In a way, what's going on is a playing out of the ongoing kind of constitutional tragedy of presidential power. And that is, in our Constitution, under Article 1, it is Congress that has the right to declare war. Under Article 2, it's the president who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So you have actually an ambiguity about who is running the country in the case of war. And it's more than an ambiguity. The president has such authority in matters of foreign policy that there's a tendency among presidents who are unpopular or who perceive their popularity to be softening, to kind of take refuge from their domestic policy ills in foreign policy. And there was a large element of that in George W. Bush, and there may be an element of that in the present government. Now, all right, so where does that leave us? I mean, is Trump permanent or temporary? Are these permanent semi-constitutional changes, or are there actually limitations on Trump? I'd like to talk about two possible things that could limit Trump's reach at this point. One is the evolution of the Democratic Party. There were a few elections, as there always are the year after a presidential election, odd year elections, including the mayoralty of New York. The Democrats swept them all. They're really getting very strong. As they get strong, they tend to be hardening on the left. It's an interesting thing. It will give the Democratic Party a lot more dynamism. You see it already. You see it in Minneapolis. It may make them less capable of taking back the White House, if indeed the left chooses the candidate. It also may make it more difficult for Democrats to reckon with why the public feels alienated from them, and so it is. It's going to have a sort of it will be a double-edged sword for their ability to stop Trump. Right now, it appears likely that the Democrats are going to pick up the House in the midterm elections, and unlikely that they're going to pick up the Senate. But they're very happy with the senatorial candidates they have, especially the one in Alaska, who has been getting a lot of publicity lately. So that is not an impossibility, and that would create an ability for the Democrats to be a nuisance to Trump, but probably not an obstruction, because really there's no legislating going on in this presidency aside from the great big beautiful bill, which was just a sort of a budget bill that made permanent certain things in the Trump tax cuts of 2017. So it's Democrats could push themselves to center stage of politics in the fall without necessarily being able to retard Trump in what he's doing. A more likely force against that will be working against Trump is just decline. And in all of this activity and in all of the talk about decadent Europe and that sort of thing, it's important to remember that the United States is, in relative to the rest of the world, still a declining power. We do not have the military, demographic, or economic means to take on larger responsibilities. That is one of the reasons for, the removal of guarantees and that sort of thing. At the time of the first Gulf War in the 1990s, the United States and Europe were responsible for about 70% of the world's GDP. The last time I looked at that number was at the start of the Ukraine war, and I think it was around 43%. Now we're even in a less favorable position before you even talk about a possible, schism in the Western alliance. So it seems to be an unpropitious time to be adding, imperial responsibilities. There have been, Americans sense this, I will say. And there have been a couple of moments. There were two moments in 2025 when American voters sensed that America had surrendered its control of its destiny to other countries. And the first was on Liberation Day, the Tariff Day, when you saw a steep drop in the polls, along with people's portfolios. And then the second, I think, interestingly, is not quite so steep a drop, but it is very interesting that after Trump's decision to bomb Iran, which seemed to promise American involvement in another Middle Eastern war, his polls fell, and they have never risen back to the level that they were on the night that Iran was bombed. Since then, we've had a military operation in Venezuela and now threats surrounding Greenland. In neither of those has there been any trace of what pollsters call a rally round the flag event. And so Trump, you can say that Trump, if he does not succeed in certain of his schemes, he is vulnerable to being turned on by the public, I think. And, whether that happens, we don't really know. But I'd like to close by talking about by listing a few contradictions that are worth keeping an eye on. One is this decline versus imperialism paradox that I'm talking about. The United States Americans remain unwilling to commit themselves to large military adventures. And yet Trump is undertaking policies that require at least the threat of that. Certainly, that you heard that in Venezuela, where the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said, we're not afraid of boots on the ground. Well, maybe our soldiers aren't afraid, but I think that a reasonable politician could be afraid of the polls. There's also a second thing that comes from the lessons Trump, this is a second contradiction that comes from a lesson that Trump learned from his first term. Trump's first term, he claims, was undermined from within by the deep state. And about this, he is absolutely right. I think Trump, there are a lot of there's a large professional civil service in the U.S. government. They did do their work of sort of undermining Trump's work, and he is not going to let that happen again. And that means that he has hired in his second administration, but for loyalty rather than expertise. And and so you have a government that works very efficiently for what it does, but is actually a little bit shorthanded. So the government is behind Trump, but it doesn't really have the capacity to take on large new responsibilities. And the final one would be, I think, would be old corruption versus new corruption. There are a lot of reasons for people to complain about the conduct of the Trump administration, which is why he keeps trying to keep the Biden administration front and center whenever he's talking about anything, which will strike the foreign observer as kind of bizarre that we're talking about an administration that ended now over a year ago. But the country does remain divided about that, and that is the logic of strife on which he's operating. I think I'm going to leave it at that, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It's really stimulating because you have been talking on different topics and on many questions, and at the same time, there is a complementarity between the different questions and between the different dimensions. Maybe I am just looking if there is a question before myself asking question. Please, if you want to ask some question, please raise the hand. It's the best way to ask the question, and I invite you to do that because you have probably a lot of questions. Let me just look if there is a question. Please. Yes, there is one question from Colleen. Colleen, you wanted to ask a question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Philip, and thanks, Mr. Caldwell, for the very interesting presentation and your point of view on the current situation. In your view, what's the most likely scenario for the situation at the moment with Greenland and the recent approach and strategy from the president? I mean, I think there's a worst case scenario, but what's the most likely scenario in your point of view that will occur? Thanks.
Well, thank you. That is a great question. I don't think that any scenario could be described as likely. There are many. I suppose some sort of physical assertion of American sovereignty. It's an interesting area. There are areas where it's possible to fudge this. Face-saving ways that the United States could go in as the major part of a NATO contingent to fortify Greenland in the way that that Denmark has suggested, that Greenland used to be fortified during the Civil War with active, air bases and that sort of thing. But if the United States did more than that, it would come up against domestic politics. I mean, and that could be very interesting. I don't know what sort of Senate ratification would be necessary of a Trumpian claim to incorporate a new polity. I mean, this again is, I'm just guessing, and it would be, but let's just say, if Trump goes beyond the present institutional structures of NATO, he will come into contact and perhaps into collision with constitutional forces in the United States. And that would be the next step beyond which I wouldn't want to guess.
Please, other questions? Andres, please, you have the floor. Not sure. He wants. Okay, maybe if there is no other question, maybe one question. You have been rising and saying that if Trump is going concerning Greenland beyond the current institutional context, he will confront at least the US institutions, maybe. But at this point in time, is there not a problem for NATO? Because at the end of the game, the force of NATO is not how much people can fight or so on, is the deterrence, it's the credibility of the NATO alliance. And of course, if the US are going beyond the current established context and confronting even in an aggressive way allies, the problem of the credibility of NATO is just going out, and you know, is when credibility it can be lost in 1 minute, but to take it back, it could take 20 years or 30 years.
Yes, it can be rebuilt. As I said, there is a very powerful current in Donald Trump's movement, and it is almost certainly a majority in the Trump movement that holds NATO to be a disadvantage to the United States rather than an advantage. That, you know, on balance, the advantage is that it gives us a large bloc to deter aggressors, and the disadvantage is that it tempts us into military adventures. In defense of the latter, I mean, if there is a defense to be made of the latter, it is that, yes, an alliance is about deterrence, but it must be capable of fighting. And there comes a time where if you haven't fought a war in 2 generations or 3 generations, the question arises of whether you are capable of fighting a war. So I don't mean to, believe me, I do not mean to defend any of the, you know, sort of frivolous uses to which the United States military has been put in the past, but fighting is part of an alliance. You know, about the danger of, you know, you lose. It is tough to have a credible deterrent when you lack esprit de corps. And I would say that this is the largest challenge that we've faced in NATO. So what would be similar challenges? France's withdrawal in 1966, I believe. The German arguments over the mid-range, over the Pershing missiles in the early 1980s. France and Germany's defection from the coalition over Iraq in 2002, and particularly the rhetoric of Gerhard Schröder, which seemed to be a sort of a nationalistic emancipation of Germany from the alliance, which is that, you know, the foreign policy decisions of Germany are going to be made in Berlin and only in Berlin. But none of these things involved a questioning of NATO by the main partner in it. And since those 3 incidents, I would say that the centrality of the United States in NATO has only grown. So yes, this is the biggest problem. It is not impossible to envision a restoration of the status quo anti-Trump in NATO, but that would require an actual threat. And I think that part of the problem between Europe and the United States is Europe, or at least many policymakers in Europe, particularly in Brussels, really believe that Russia is such a threat. And that is just not shared at all in the United States. There are, I mean, the attitude, pardon me for putting it so bluntly, but the attitude in the United States towards Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war is indifference, just not, I don't mean a contemptuous indifference, but just a sense that it doesn't really have much bearing on the national security of the United States.
Yes, of course, what you say is very important because we have that similitude. We see that Europe is less concerned by China than the US are concerned by China. And I can imagine immediately that the same position is linking the US with Russia. That is, Russia is more the problem of Europe than the problem of the US. Of course, because in between US and Russia, there is Europe, and in between Europe and China, there is Russia, and therefore we see in this geographic or design, there could be some tension between those sharing not exactly the same border, but which are really on the same side, and of course in more or less not maybe in competition, but of course if they don't share the same border, what is at stake is probably much less than for those who are sharing the same border.
Yes.
I look at the question, please. Irene, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I've always been given to understand that part of the economic strength in the US comes from its favorable demographic profile, largely driven by immigration and having a younger workforce compared to Europe, for instance. Do the current measures, the anti-immigration measures of Trump, are they just basically window dressing without having an impact on the available workforce, or would you say it's having a measurable degree on the economic ability of the country?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I do think that the United States has a relative demographic advantage, although it is waning. I mean, I remember when I first looked at these numbers a quarter of a century ago, the United States was well over the replacement level of 2.1 children per women that is necessary to keep your population stable. It's now fallen. The United States is a very interesting case because it's such a diverse country, but it's fallen to about 1.6, which is about what an average European country was 10 years ago. But it's got great variations in that, so that if you go to sort of booming states that were formerly southern and rural, they are at or over replacement level. They're healthy. They're like in a European context what France or Scandinavia are relative to or France or particularly Sweden are relative to other countries. But if you go to old sophisticated parts of the country that developed early industrial, like New England, the birth rates are really very low. They're like certain parts of Italy, they're like Sardinia. They're or like China. China's birth rate is below 1. I mean, I'm sorry, it's total fertility is below 1. So yes, so the United States retains this advantage. Part of it comes from migration and the increased fecundity of migrants. I think that the general justification for immigration has been that migrants would help us pay for the welfare state. This is a very short-term way of thinking, though, because of course, migrants also they age and they retire and they die and they need to be cared for then. So unless they are outperforming the natives, they're not going to be a particularly good investment. They're not going to change your balance sheet. When I spoke earlier in this talk about how Trump's first term economic policy was generally popular, this was a large part of what I was talking about, is the labor shortage it created. And it's a very hard thing to read. On the one hand, it creates an inefficiency. It clogs up the labor market, and it may have cause a slight drag on GDP. On the other hand, because it tightens the labor market, it does have a short and medium term positive effect on wages. And in a country where inequality has reached the levels that it has in the United States, that may actually be a positive corrective. So, you could say, I don't know what the ideal level of population growth is for the United States. I would like it if we're sort of like generating enough childbirth to have a stable population. It's theorized by people that if you can make the economy more just and more productive, that people will want to have more children. But finding the policy that achieves that has eluded most of the countries that have tried to do it. If I could just add one thing, and not to make this too long an answer to your very interesting question, there are certain intuitions that Trump has had economically that have made a certain amount of sense, but the rationales keep changing. And I would say that tariffs have been used in a similar way to demographic to low immigration policy. That is, they're supposed to justify 3 different outcomes at once. And in the beginning, tariffs were mostly talked about as a way to revitalize American industry. And that was really meant to be part of a demographic policy. The idea is that, most Americans, most Americans don't want to have children if they can't have productive work. So we want to go back to the kind of economy that we had in the industrial age, when there was productive work for people at all levels of society. And that, I think, was whether that was something that Trump really intended, or whether that was just wishful thinking that the public imposed on his policies, I don't know. But in fact, that has been the least important aspect of the tariff policy right now. The tariff policy has been used much more to raise revenue and to threaten geostrategic rivals than it has been to alter the economy to make it more egalitarian and more family friendly. So I don't know that, I guess to sum up, there ought to be ways to replace immigration as a source of population growth and welfare state financing, but we're not really making much progress towards finding them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are going beyond the schedule, but we have 3 questions. I just suggest we look at them, and sorry for all the participants, we will be obliged to stop, so otherwise we will take too much time from Christopher. I have first from James Dixon, then from Colin Kearney, and then from Tyrone Taylor. Please, James, could you ask your question yourself? But I suggest we leave beside your question on Mark Carney, because it's more secondary question, and concentrate on your question on Greenlight Greenland, which is, of course, a geopolitical question which is important. James, you have the floor, except if you don't want to ask yourself the question, but I think the best is that you do that by yourself. James? Okay. The question of James was very simple. He has the following: does not the US already have an essentially unlimited ability to build, expand military bases in Greenland already? I am struggling to understand what is to be gained by an imperialist approach to the US owning Greenland. I leave the rest, which is more a comment, but I think it's a question, what is to be gained in a more aggressive approach of Greenland than just a very easy way to get probably military bases multiplied by 2, 3, 4, even 5 without any difficulty.
Yes. Well, yes, this is an aspect of the question that I mentioned earlier,
Yes.
About whether NATO is actually the problem that NATO that Trump is trying to solve. I mean, you look objectively at Greenland, you can say, okay, if you assume that Russia and China have designs on Greenland and you want to defend it against them, isn't it easier to do so with a united NATO and all the resources that it brings? Which it not only brings more resources, but it gives you a stronger position within your alliance. Why do it without them? Why do it on your own? I think there are two possible answers. One is the one that I've mentioned, which is that the United States doesn't want to be in NATO. Now no one has said this, okay, but I mean, this behavior is sort of consistent with, let's just say, a loosening of the United States' ties to NATO. The other possibility is that they don't believe that any system of joint condominium over a strategic resource is really reliable enough. I mean, we have a good example of that in another sort of imperial, post-imperial relationship with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, there are pieces of Ukraine that are culturally and historically Russian that exited the Soviet Union with Ukraine, but which Russia considered vitally important to its national interest, and like Crimea, which has is the linchpin of its naval power in the Black Sea. Russia felt it couldn't do without it, and so it made these deals of leasing, very expensive leasing, very expensive sort of subsidies of oil and gas to Ukraine, in an attempt to have a non-ownership stake in Crimea to be able to keep the bases. And that proved not a reliable arrangement for Russia. Perhaps this is an analogous situation.
Yes, sure. Maybe a further question, Colleen, you had a question. I let you ask it.
Yeah, Philippe, maybe because I already asked, I can pass it to Tyrone if you wish.
Yours short.
Yeah, I can pass it to Tyrone because he raised his hand before I put it in the chat.
It was before. Okay,
yeah,
we can.
Yeah.
Tyrone, maybe first, and then Colleen.
Yes, how y'all doing? I want to ask. He made a statement about Robert F. Kennedy and how Americans supported his nutrition chart. With his limited scientific background, I don't know anyone who actually supports Robert F. Kennedy. So I just want to know, where'd you get that information where Americans support his nutrition chart?
Yeah, I didn't say they supported Kennedy as a public figure, but I do read in the Times and in the Post, that consumption of meat, for instance, is rising. That what Kennedy says about proteins is in diets is increasingly accepted by consumers. I'm really not making a claim for the science in this. And also that certain schools are changing their vaccine schedules. Here's another area where I think where Denmark comes in. I think that the model is to simplify the American vaccination schedule so that it's more like the Danish one. I'm really not making a comment on the science. I'm just saying that it's having that it's penetrating, it's finding a sympathetic reception among the public.
Maybe Colin?
Yeah, Philip, my question, Mr. Caldwell, is just around kind of trying to join the dots between what's going on in Greenland and the threat to NATO's existence, and then the creation of this new board of peace, which I know is being set up for Gaza, but it seems to have further intentions down the line. So I don't know if you can comment on that, and if there is some link there, if it all is linked in together in terms of the strategy from Donald Trump at the moment.
Yeah, I think those are two different things. I would call the Greenland, whatever form it takes and whatever skepticism it reflects towards our alliances. Greenland is a historic, strategic. I won't say an interest, but there have been American strategic thinkers who've thought that Greenland would be a very nice addition to the American strategic portfolio. And it's also unquestionable that that Greenland's strategic importance has risen, both with the with the new importance of rare earths and other minerals, and the navigability of the northern waters, as whether as shipping or routes or military corridors due to global warming. I think the Board of Peace is a much stranger thing, particularly against the backdrop of, of course, everyone would like peace in Gaza, but the main Trump proposal so far is so, maybe it will come to make sense at some points, but it's very hard to read just how the commercial development of Gaza is going to result in a concrete project or anything. So for now, it's just maybe I lack imagination, but it seems to be very far from a workable foreign policy. I'm not saying it doesn't have another justification, or it might, but I don't see how you can build a foreign policy out of it.
Thank you so much. And just to comment on what you are saying, having a good knowledge of Arab and Muslim countries, and moreover of the situation in Middle East, I only share your point of view. It's for me very, very strange the way it has been dealt with, and not sure it is going to peace in any case. But I think we will have to stop. Christopher, we have taken much of your time and even beyond schedule. I have noted many things because you raised a lot of point of view which give insights in the current position in the US, and sometimes, especially when viewed from Europe, is difficult to understand. And what you have said on NATO, what you have said on the contradiction, the dialectic which is currently at play in the US between decline and power, which is very important. And of course, we have to think about, and it will help us at least to design design some more probably interesting scenarios for the future, even if they are imagined. And but therefore, because of all these insightful comments you made, stimulating comments, I would like to thank you very, very, very much. And I think it will help us manage the risk of the future. Not sure it will help us surely to control, but surely to try to manage it. I would like also to ask, especially Guillaume Duval, to be indulgent, because he had a question on the dollar, but I think the question on the dollar will push us very, very late and very much beyond schedule.
That's not a problem, Philippe. That was just a question in mind.
Yes, it's a question we could discuss and maybe send the question to Christopher. And in any case, Christopher, thank you very much. It was very, very fascinating and passionate to listen to you. And you have, of course, helped us to understand much better what is at play in between the US and Europe, and giving us a better inside view of the US, which is absolutely key for understanding the current situation.
Well, thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you to everyone. And it's been great to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
I
very
don't
much.
know if you have just few minutes, we remain in touch when all people have closed, or please, thank you to all auditors, and we will close the conversation. And I have many thanks for you, Christopher. Many message.
I'm so
People
touched by that. That's very nice.
No. There are many, and you had and people were really very highly interested in what you have been saying. Okay, let me just look, because there are some people connected. Not sure we are.
Still, some
Yes.
colleagues.
Yeah.
So 15.
I don't know how
So,
to disconnect, because either I disconnect everyone. No, I just wanted maybe, Christopher, I think what you have been saying is very interesting. If you allow me, I will share the webinar with Jean-Claude. I think his first reaction will probably be the same as mine. Is, will you accept to translate a webinar into a paper? Because it's many things you have been explaining are not so common in current analysis, which are made in Europe, and I think they help understand what is at stake, which is probably much more than simply a disagreement or something like that. Much more structural. It's at stake.
Yes.
And not only the personality of Trump, of course, which may magnify some of the problems in the way he is dealing the problems, but behind that we have structural questions you have been highlighting, which are really fascinating, and we have to think about them.
I would love to talk to you about that, Philippe. Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah.
I will share that with Jean-Claude, and probably he will have the same reaction as mine.
Whatever,
if you accept.
Send in my regards.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Therefore, we will
do,
and really thank you. And as soon as you are in Europe, please, before that, let us know that we organize something, either lunch or dinner, and it will be so nice, and to pursue the discussion.
Wonderful. That's to Sophie. Thank you, Zaying.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you in Paris.
Okay, I hope so.
Thank you.
Bye to all those who remain connected,
Bye to
and we
everyone.
will close the session.
Did it?